Welcome to Sci-Fi Screen. Subscribe for epic worlds and the future brought to life. The sky burned crimson over Vel'Kara. 3 fractured moons hung like shattered teeth against clouds thick with ash, their reflections trembling in the evacuation lights that swept across the dying world. Ships of every design, organic vessels that pulsed like living hearts, crystalline transports that hummed with ancient frequencies, and angular military frigates rose in columns toward the stars, carrying millions away from the planet that had nurtured them for millennia. The ground trembled constantly now, each quake a reminder that time was a luxury no one possessed. The Terran stood at the edge of what had once been the central spire district, now a maze of collapsed infrastructure and twisted metal. While others moved toward the extraction points, this human moved against the tide, scanner held high, searching for signatures that might have been missed. The evacuation coordinator had called them in twice already. Twice, the human had acknowledged and continued searching. There were protocols, yes, but there were also lives. The Terran had seen too many wars, too many worlds left behind, to board a ship while the scanners still showed unaccounted signals. Terran actual, this is Scout 7-3. The voice crackled through the helmet speaker. We've got weak biosigns, Sector 9 Gamma, near the old gravity bridge. Multiple contacts, small, non-responsive to standard hails. The human's breath caught. Sector 9 Gamma had been flagged as cleared hours ago. The gravity bridge there was one of the first casualties of the planetary shifter, beautiful piece of Vel'Karan engineering that had connected the residential terraces to the education centers, now little more than a skeletal framework suspended over a chasm that dropped into darkness. The Terran was already running. The approach took precious minutes through rubble-choked streets. When the bridge finally came into view, the human's heart sank. The structure looked like broken fingers reaching across a void, its graviton emitters flickering erratically, creating visible distortions in the air pockets where gravity doubled or vanished entirely. And there, huddled beneath a collapsed overhang on the far side, were the cubs. 6 of them. Their bodies were small, no larger than Earth's large dogs, but their anatomy was distinctly Vel'Karan, sleek reptilian frames covered in fine downy fur, with wide, luminous eyes that reflected the evacuation lights. They pressed against each other, trembling, their heads swiveling toward every sound. When the Terran's boots hit the platform, one of them, braver or more desperate than the others, stood and released the sound halfway between a hiss and a whimper. The human slowly knelt, lowering profile, making the body smaller, less threatening. Hands moved to the helmet seals, and with a hiss of equalizing pressure, the helmet came off. The air was acrid, full of smoke and ozone, but the cubs needed to see a face, not a mask. The Terran's features were weathered, marked by scars and years, but the eyes were soft. "Hey," the human said, voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, little ones, it's okay, I'm here to help." The cubs didn't understand the words, how could they? But perhaps they understood the tone. One took a tentative step forward, another growled low, protective. A third buried its face against its sibling's flank. The bridge shuddered violently, and all 6 dropped flat, crying out in terror. The Terran's scanner painted the grim truth in glowing red overlays. The bridge's structural integrity was at 11% and falling. Graviton emitters were failing in sequence, creating dead zones where a single misstep would mean a fatal fall. Emergency broadcasts counted down, 8 minutes, until projected total collapse. A hover vehicle couldn't navigate the distortions safely, and there wasn't time to call in specialized equipment, even if any remained planetside. The human set down the rifle with deliberate slowness, then the sidearm, then the utility pack, each piece of equipment placed carefully on the ground, creating distance between weapons and intent. The cubs watched, heads tilting in that universal gesture of confusion mixed with curiosity. One of them, the smallest, with markings like silver tears down its face, took 2 steps forward before fear pulled it back. The Terran pulled a light beacon from the belt, activated it with a soft chime, and rolled it gently onto the bridge. It settled in a stable gravity zone, pulsing steady blue, a marker, a promise, a lighthouse in chaos. The human met the eyes of each cub in turn, then dropped 2 hands and knees. The posture was everything. Not standing tall, not leading from height or strength, but vulnerable, low, moving at their level. The Terran began to crawl onto the bridge, palms flat against the still warm metal, knees following, slow and steady. The structure groaned but held, 20 meters to cross. An eternity compressed into minutes. One cub, the brave one, extended its neck, watching intently. Its front paw lifted, hovered over empty space, then retreated. The small one with silver markings chirped softly, a sound of yearning. But fear held them frozen. The human paused, looked back, and deliberately mimicked the small cub's chirp, imperfect, clumsy, but recognizable. Then continued crawling. The action spoke what words couldn't. See, like this, together, you can do this. The brave cub stepped onto the bridge. One paw, two. It dropped to its belly, instinct and observation merging, and began to pull itself forward the way the Terran did. The small one followed immediately, unwilling to be separated. Then a third, but three remained behind, paralyzed, their cries growing desperate. The bridge bucked as another emitter died. A section to the left dropped half a meter before stabilizing, the metal screaming. The human moved faster, but not too fast, always keeping the cubs in peripheral vision, always maintaining that steady rhythm. Crawl, breathe, crawl, breathe. The three following cubs matched the pace, their bodies low, their eyes locked on the human's back. Halfway across, the Terran stopped. The three cubs who'd followed stopped too, confusion in their tilted heads. The human looked back at the ones left behind, stretched out one hand in a gesture that transcended species command, waited. The bridge shook. 5 minutes remaining on the countdown. But the human waited. The fourth cub broke first, launching itself forward in a scrambling run that nearly became a stumble. It crashed into the others, and they all slid briefly before catching traction. For now moving, the fifth hesitated only a moment longer before following, as if the spell of paralysis had finally broken. But the sixth, the largest, perhaps the eldest, marked with stripes like ancient writing, remained frozen, pressed against the overhang, eyes wide with primal terror. A transmission burst through the abandoned helmet behind them. All personnel, final extraction in 3 minutes. Repeat, final extraction. The human didn't hear it. The world had narrowed to this moment, this bridge, these lives. The Terran crawled backward. The other 5 cubs had almost reached the beacon, almost reached safety, but the human moved away from salvation, back toward the one left behind. The large cub watched this impossible thing, a creature, returning to danger, and something shifted in its gaze. The human reached the midpoint, then extended a hand again, palm up, fingers spread, defenseless, trusting. The large cub's body shuddered with a decision forming. Its siblings called from ahead, voices urgent and high. The bridge dropped another 10 centimeters, tilting at a sickening angle. The large cub took one step, then another. Then it was crawling, belly to metal, moving with desperate determination toward the waiting human. When it reached the Terran, it pressed its head briefly against the human's shoulder, a gesture of surrender, trust, or perhaps gratitude before continuing forward. They all crawled together then, 7 bodies low to the trembling structure, moving as one unit toward the blue beacon light. The human could hear metal tearing behind them, could feel sections of the bridge beginning their final fall. But ahead was solid ground, and on that ground stood Vel'Karan adults who'd been searching for their young. Their faces so different from human faces, yet somehow expressing the same desperate hope, watching the procession with held breath. 20 meters became 10, 10 became 5. The cubs reached the platform and were immediately surrounded by relieved caretakers who pulled them to safety, checking them frantically. The Terran was 3 meters away when the section behind collapsed entirely, vanishing into the chasm with a sound like worlds ending. The human reached the platform, rolled onto solid ground, and lay there breathing hard. The cubs broke free from their caretakers and swarmed the Terran, their small bodies pressing close, making sounds that could have been purrs or sobs or laughter. Soft paws touched scarred hands, wide eyes met exhausted ones. A Vel'Karan commander, its crest fully extended in agitation, approached with arms crossed. That was against every protocol, reckless. You could have died, and we'd have lost 7 instead of possibly 6. The human sat up slowly, cubs still clinging. But we didn't lose anyone. Above them, a drone that had been documenting the evacuation hung in the air, its lens having captured everything. The footage was already being transmitted, already spreading from ship to ship, from species to species, racing across the fleet faster than light could travel through empty space. In the command centers of a dozen vessels, beings of vastly different origins watched the same scene, a human, crawling, 6 small lives, following one species reaching across the gulf of form and fear to touch another with nothing but patience, vulnerability, and the simple willingness to go first into danger. The Vel'Karans had a word in their language, ancient and rarely used, that meant something like one who walks with us more. They shortened it, adapted it, made it a name: Bridgewalker. By the time the evacuation fleet reached the first way station, children across 100 worlds were playing a new game, dropping to their hands and knees, crawling like they'd seen in the video, giggling as they called to each other, "I'm the Terran, follow me." The footage played at the Unity Summit 6 months later, where representatives gathered to discuss post-evacuation policies and refugee integration. It played on screens while delegates argued about resource allocation and territorial rights. And when the shouting grew too loud, someone would replay those minutes: the crawl, the follow, the salvation, and the chamber would quiet. One of the cubs, now adolescent, attended that summit as part of a youth delegation. When asked to speak, they rose still small, still marked with those silver tears, said in carefully learned standard, "We crossed because someone showed us it was possible. Not with strength, not with weapons, with crawling." The human never attended those summits. The Terran had returned to Earth, to a small dwelling near old forests, wanting only quiet after too many years of war. But the cubs found them anyway, now grown enough to travel alone, bearing gifts, a medal the human would never wear, stories of lives built and futures forged, and tears that fell freely on both sides of an embrace that needed no translation. On Vel'Kara, built now, slowly healing, they erected a monument at the site where the old gravity bridge had been. The new span was called Terran's Reach, and on ceremonial days, children would cross it on hands and knees, remembering at the bridge's center stood a statue, a figure on all fours, head turned back, one hand extended. The inscription beneath, translated into every known language, read simply, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is going first, so others may follow."